Hello, everyone. We are almost in the end of our school. So our class now is with Professor Alexandre Gori Maia on how employment shapes inequality. Gori is an associate professor at the Economics Institute here at Unicamp. He has a PhD and a master's degree in applied economics from Unicamp and a bachelor's degree in statistics from Unicamp as well. His research focuses on demographic economics, agriculture and environmental economics, well-being and poverty, health and inequality. He has published books, chapters and papers in important journals in his research field, some of them with Professor Sakamoto. He has published in the climate and development, land use policy, population and environment, International Journal of Climate Change Strategies and Management, and so on. So thank you very much, Gori, for your contribution to this school. It's a great pleasure to have you here. So please, the floor or the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Carol. Let me share my screen. Okay. I think everything is working. Well, first, I want to congratulate my colleagues for organizing this excellent winter course for us here in Brazil. Special thanks to Carol, Roberto, Alex, who really worked hard to put this second meeting on track. And I'm also really glad to make this presentation after my colleague Arthur Sakamoto. We have done some studies on occupational structure and inequality. And we suffer a lot, Sakamoto, to publish these papers. It's not so easy. I was always impressed by the patience of Sakamoto with a young professor when I first met Sakamoto, something like 10 years ago or more. And when he was a professor at University of Texas in Austin. Sakamoto is really good in economics, econometrics, and sociology. He knew econometrics much more than me, and I am an econometrician. So yeah, this is true. It's hard to dialogue with someone who knows much more than you. I remember when Sakamoto recommended me a paper by David the author and Acemoglu on the polarization of the occupational structure in the United States and Europe. Sakamoto, I was terrified. I said, oh my God, these guys are so good. They did one single paper, everything I was planning to do in all my academic life. Since then, I realized how difficult it is to catch up on knowledge from others. I think this is one of my main topics in this presentation. We need to overcome our historical and structural constraints at the same time that we need to adapt to technological changes taking place in other places. But it's not so easy. Like it's not so easy work with really experienced researchers. Well, let me start with the concepts of inequality. Probably you know it much more than me. We have different concepts and measures and of inequality. For example, we can just compare inequality between countries, between nations, or we can compare inequality between nations. Sakamoto explained this, that people don't care so much about inequality between nations, especially in this book of Why Nations Fail. If you analyze inequality between countries, inequality is growing in the world. When you analyze between countries, depending if you consider China or not. If China is 10% of the population, makes difference. We can also use different dimensions to measure inequality. Would be great if we could measure wealth, but it's not so easy to work wealth. We don't have information on wealth, besides the Forbes rankings of world's billionaires, it's much easier to work with income and consumption. This information usually comes from household surveys. At some extent, I think they are good proxies for what is happening in the total inequality, but we must take care because we are not talking about billionaires like Jeff Bezos or George Lehman in Brazil. We are talking about ordinary people like us here. Depending on the criteria that you use, you can have opposite results. In this presentation, I will use some indicators for labor market. And so we can see that we are talking about between the 99% of the population. We are excluding 1% of the population. That I don't believe that these billionaires would be ever interviewed by a household survey. If they have, probably they underreported their earnings. So we must take care with this analysis. I use a lot of comparison between Brazil and United States. When I'm presenting the results for Brazil and United States, I ask, but why are you comparing countries that are so different? Sakamoto explained in the first lecture that, okay, why nations fail, but we were twin brothers when we were discovered 500 years ago. We are controlling for sure 1,000 of years of evolution of the human species. But anyway, we were colonized almost simultaneously, and we had several similarities in the process of development, like we had initially large-scale farming with the brutal slave labors. We had also huge immigration of Europeans and Asians. Brazil has the largest Japanese population living here, for example. The largest Japanese population living outside Japan. But at some point we took different routes, and this explains the huge levels of inequality that we have between these countries. So I think they provide a nice perspective to analyze one developing and one developed nations. They are huge countries, and they are also representative that the levels of the difference that we have between developing and developed countries in the world. Okay, so let's start with sources of income in Brazil and the United States. In this picture, okay, I'm an econometrician, so I will show you a lot of data here, but don't worry so much. We have huge difference between Brazil and United States. For example, on average, per capita income in Brazil is 4 times lower than in the United States. This value is considered difference in the purchasing parity power, and also difference due to the family size, because children consume less than adults, so it's a fair comparison. Some studies suggest that 2/3 of the total inequality in the world is due to the average difference between countries. So the place where you were born will play a major role in determining if you are rich or are poor in the world. The problem is more severe because we have twin inequality. Many individuals even from poor countries, like Lilian asked to Sakamoto in the prior presentation, do not have access to some advantages and opportunities that the country should confer for everyone. In other words, we may have huge levels of twin inequality in each country. For example, in Brazil, inequality is higher than the United States. We have nearly 50% of the population living with nearly $600 per month. It's not so much. Half of the population live with less than $60 per month. This per capita income is 10 times lower than the percentile 99, which is the value that divides the 1% richest from everybody else. So difference between Brazil and the United States are also remarkable. For example, the percentile 90 in Brazil is lower than the percentile 40 in the United States. What does it mean? That for example, that many people in the bottom 40% in the United States have an average income that is higher than many guys in the top 5 or 10% groups of the income distribution in Brazil. A university professor in Brazil like us is probably in the top 10 or even top 5% in Brazil of the income distribution. But I cannot compare this professor. If I move to the United States, my income will be lower than any unskilled labor in the United States. I remember my sabbatical year that I could barely afford my rent in the poorest neighborhood where I lived. Sakamoto went to visit me there. The poorest Americans are relatively well off by the Brazilian standards. Okay, but I will not compare my standard of living with this Sakamoto, for example. It's not a fair comparison. The good news is that happiness is relative. We will probably compare our standard of living with colleagues, with our social peers, like Carol, Roberto, Ivete. I will not compare with Sakamoto from the richest Texas university. It's okay, it's the only good news. We have some limitations, some constraints in Brazil. One primary problem in Brazil is that our middle class is poor. I will show in the next slides that this is one of the reasons is that we have a lot of unskilled workers in the middle class positions in Brazil. This makes inequality even worse because middle class is important, I think, for inequality, for social cohesion, like Sakamoto highlighted. Also, in order to have social mobility, you need a strong middle class. Otherwise, we are moving from a bottom class to a middle class with low stability of income and employment. The good news in Brazil is that inequality reduced in the last decade. The Gini reduced more than 10%. This is a remarkable reduction, especially because most countries in the world increased inequality in the last decade. The bad news is that inequality is even higher than the United States, a country that also has a really high level of inequality. Well, what else can we say about income? We can also see how inequality affects the difference between social groups. We know, for example, that human capital and education are one of the main drivers of economic growth and inequality in the world. And we are performing really poor in terms of educational attainment, not only we here in Brazil, but most developing countries. For example, if we consider the share of people with superior diploma in Brazil, we have only 15% of the labor force with superior diploma. In the United States, almost everybody, but 50% of the population with a superior diploma. In Brazil, the hourly earnings of people with superior diploma are 4 times higher than people with only elementary education. So it matters. If you have a higher skill, probably you can have a higher earnings. The share of skilled workers impacts also economic growth and inequality because it may reduce the wage premium of this group. We witness this behavior in Brazil. In other words, the larger the share of skilled workers, the smaller is the marginal returns of education. So you can reduce inequality, increasing the share of people with higher educational attainments. Brazil has also a young population. Age structure is important for economic growth. Prime age workers usually have higher productivity. It can stimulate economic growth. We have also a huge inequality between racial groups. In Brazil, blacks and mulattoes represent 50% of our population, and their earnings are nearly 40% lower than the white workers. Women participation is increasing in Brazil, which is a good news because it can stimulate economic growth in the short run. The participation of women in the labor force is still lower than in most developed countries. In this last, what else? These last columns are comparing I have the ratio between the average earnings in United States and in Brazil for each social group. The difference range, for example, between 2 and 4. This means that similar social groups in the United States earn between 2 and 4 times more than in Brazil, correcting for purchasing parity power again. When you have higher levels of inequality, usually the social groups, the most vulnerable social groups are subjected to higher levels of inequality. This is what happens in Brazil. When you compare, for example, the workers with superior diploma in the United States, they earn approximately 2 times more than workers with a superior diploma in Brazil. When we compare unskilled workers in Brazil and the United States, they earn 3 times more than in Brazil. So inequality, it's higher inequality implies that the most vulnerable social groups are subject to usually to higher levels of inequality. Again, a good piece of news in Brazil is that inequality is reduced in the last decade. Now is increasing again. Both labor market and social policies are important to understand why we had these dynamics, this reduction of inequality in Brazil. For example, the labor market was especially benefited by an unusual growth of the commodity prices in the world. Institutions also matter because we have the minimum wage here in Brazil that is much more important than the United States, I think, because we have 1/4 of the population approximately receiving minimum wage. So small changes in the minimum wage can have huge impacts on income distribution. There is also a huge debate in Brazil what happens if you increase minimum wage. During a period, minimum wage, the raise of minimum wage was really positive for income growth and also to reduce inequality. But now some people say that, okay, if you increase more the minimum wage, we can increase inequality because we have a huge informal labor market that these guys do not have access to minimum wage. So I will not talk about that, but there is also another discussion on the role of minimum wage on income distribution. So let me explain. These figures show the accumulated variation in the per capita income for the labor of the 10% richest and the 40% poorest. The poorest are the light blue, and the richest are the dark blue lines. The index is equal to 100 in 1983, so it reflects the variation, the accumulated variation of the labor income of the richest and the poorest. You can see that in Brazil, the labor income of the poorest grew much faster than the labor income of the richest. In the United States, it was the opposite. Labor income of the richest grew faster than the labor income of the poorest. This means that wage inequality increased in the United States and reduced in Brazil. This is one main conclusion of our studies. Acemoglu and author highlighted this trend, explained how employment polarization in the United States and other developed countries contributed to increase inequality. Information technology can easily replace routine tasks with machines, and these tasks are usually performed by middle-class blue collars in the United States. Or globalization can offshore these jobs to India or China. Not for Brazil, because we are not so successful attracting these middle-class jobs. The polarization also means that robots cannot easily replace mechanized low-skilled tasks that require some kind of cognitive abilities, such as caring for the elderly and cleaning the house. I can buy a shirt at Amazon.com, but I cannot use my robot vacuum to clean my apartment because it's not so easy to clean an apartment. A robot vacuum cannot replace easily a low-skill service activity. In other words, middle-class groups in developed countries like sales workers are losing ground and is increasing. The society is polarized between high-skilled workers and low-skilled service workers. Income from labor represents nearly 80% of the total income reported in household surveys. We have on the report, of course, but for both labor income and other sources of income also. Labor income is also more important for the richest because the poorest rely a lot on social benefits. In the United States, for example, income from labor represents more than 90% of the total income reported in household surveys. Other sources of income includes not only social policy, pensions, investments, rents, social benefits, among others. In Brazil, cash transfers is really important, and also pension is important component of other sources. Now I try to put here everything together, the trend of other sources in Brazil and in the United States for the richest, the darker line, and the poorest, the lighter line. I put in red the trend of the dynamics of the other source of income for the poorest in Brazil, because we had a peculiar dynamics. They grew almost 5 times the income from other sources for the poorest in Brazil, because we had a huge expansion of cash transfers and also rural pensions. Now everybody in Brazil can have access to a pension. If you have a per capita income that is lower than 1/4 of minimum wage, you are allowed to receive a pension, no matter if you contributed or not to the pension system. This was really important to reduce poverty. Usually people focus only on cash transfers, but rural pensions played a much more important role, I think, in terms of the total amount of resources that were targeted to the poorest, especially in rural areas. And these pensions are regulated by the minimum wage. So we have the composition effect, the income effect, because the minimum wage also increased a lot in the period. So we have both effects, a larger share of the population receiving pensions and social benefits, and also the amount that was transferred increased a lot. Okay, now I will try to focus on other aspects of inequality, which is labor productivity. We try to, Sakamoto recommend, okay, you must take in consideration labor productivity in Brazil. United States, people don't care so much with labor productivity because labor productivity is high enough to distribute. But in Brazil, we have to care with labor productivity because it's too low. I will try to highlight here that our problem is not just the structure of activities that we are specialized in commodities. In the United States, they are specialized in services with high technology. Labor productivity is low in Brazil for all the sectors. When we compare the difference between 3 and 4 times higher in the United States for any kind of sector that you compare. What can I say here? It's really hard to say if the economic growth that determines inequality or inequality that determines economic growth. You don't know exactly which variable comes first. Inequality can impair growth, for example, when those with low incomes suffer poor health and low productivity because they can barely afford investments in education. In other words, you are losing talents in our economy. and when you don't have provide access for everybody for education. Inequality can also be a result of economic growth, because technological change can be skill bias, in the sense that improvements in technology increase the demand for skilled workers. Only the most skilled workers will benefit from economic growth. You can have inequality being determined by economic growth. Economic growth also depends on demographic changes. Shifts in the population age structure have important implications for the supply and the quality of workers in the economy. Again, the larger the share of prime age adults, which is between 25 and 45 years old in the labor force, the larger is the economic growth. We had the demographic bonus, which is a tipping point in this relation. It happens when the share of working age population is higher than the share of non-productive population, children and the elderly. From this point ahead, we are reducing the share of the prime age, working age population, which can be more difficult to grow. We need to improve productivity. We cannot grow anymore just adding labor force, people, adults in the labor force. In Brazil and other developing nations, economic growth has been particularly boosted by this population growth, because we had the high fertility rates in the earlier decades. For example, when you compare here the accumulated growth in Brazil and the United States in the last 4 decades, they were not so different, but we had a remarkable difference in the growth of labor force. The labor force in Brazil grew much faster than the labor force in the United States. The United States is growing, especially because of the immigrants. Otherwise, I think the growth would be much lower. Okay, I will not explain here the crisis that we faced in this whole period. I just want to highlight here that when you compare the accumulated variation of the GDP growth and the economic active population, the labor force growth, compare here Brazil, 155, population, labor force, 107. United States, 40% of increase of the labor force in the United States, too low. So it's almost three times higher the growth of labor force in Brazil than the United States. What is the implications? The implications is that we are growing, but the labor force is growing only because labor productivity is not on the left and in the United States. They are the same graph. Brazil, labor productivity on the left, hourly and earnings on the right. Brazil is green, United States is red. Again, the dynamics of economic growth and labor force have implications for labor productivity. This is not a problem in the United States when you can see that the labor productivity is really high, is nearly 4 times higher than in Brazil. And difference are even worse, like we see in the previous slides, the labor force in Brazil grew much faster than the United States. Unfortunately, I do not have recent trends. We finished our research in 2013 or something, 2015. But I can guarantee that the scenario is even worse for Brazil. But since the end of the commodity boom, we are facing frequent political and economic crises in Brazil, while the United States and other developing countries benefit a lot from the economic growth in the last years. Okay, now we can better understand the relationship between labor productivity and average earnings, computing the ratio between these series. In these figures, we show the ratio between between earnings and labor productivity. We call this measure as relative wage. So if this is the trend between 1983 to 2013, the closer this red line, the relative age is, the closer this line is to 1, means that earnings are growing as fast as productivity. Otherwise, if you have, for example, a value of relative wage lower than 1, means that productivity is growing faster than relative wage. In Brazil, for example, we have several periods when the relative wage was much higher than 1. This means that earnings grew much faster than labor productivity. Okay, this is good. This is good for redistribution of income. The problem is that the series tend to be co-integrated. We cannot move so far from the line from labor productivity. In other words, this red line cannot move so far from 1 in the whole series. You can see here, okay, in this period here in 1986, Plano Cruzado in Brazil, the earnings grew faster than labor productivity. What happens in the next year? Okay, the red line converged to 1 again. In the years 2000, in the 90s, we have the same problem. Average earnings grew much faster than labor productivity. In Plano Real, what happened in the next years? Again, the relative wage converged to 1. The earnings converged to labor productivity. We had the same problem here in 2000, in the 2000s. The earnings grew much faster than labor productivity. I do not have the next series, but probably we experienced a reduction of the average earnings in Brazil in the last years. This is probably because labor productivity is calling, come back, earnings, please. So, okay, institution is really important. Again, here, institution, I mean minimum wage in Brazil to grow average earnings, but we cannot forget labor productivity. Otherwise, it will be unsuccessful, like we are experiencing for 4 decades this problem in Brazil. We cannot insist too much in this. In other words, we need to improve labor productivity. I don't know how to improve labor productivity. We have a manual, several manuals say what you have to do, but we never. I will talk about that. In some cases, we were successful, but it's not so easy. In the United States, you can see that. Okay, you have a more market-oriented economy, so the relative wages does not move so far from 1. Only after the financial crisis here in 2008, where you can see that productivity grew faster than earnings, probably because several people lose their jobs, and so you have this shock here. Well, now let me introduce our occupational structure. We did an effort here trying to compare the occupational structure in Brazil and the United States. It's not so easy to make a comparison between these two countries, especially because we have several methodological changes in this period. So you have to change the aggregation every year. Why occupations? Occupations are important because occupations are linked to several dimensions of inequality. Occupations define income generation in the short and the long term. Occupations also play a central role in social status and political prestige. For example, an engineer probably has a higher prestige than a sociologist. Sakamoto said once that his parents were shocked when he tried to convince them, okay, I want to be a sociologist. Oh my God, no to that. You must be like your cousins. You must be a doctor, engineer, because you have social prestige. No matter if Sakamoto's a full professor in a really rich university, have a lot of grants, but social prestige is also important. Okay, I'm joking because sociologists also has social prestige, but you can be a truck driver having a really nice earnings, but we will not have the same social prestige that we professors in Brazil, that our earnings not so good, but we still have some kind of social prestige here, and we hope so that we still hold some social prestige. Okay, changes in occupational structure also are important to understand the demand for skills. So because in this sense, occupations are also related to technological development. Okay, let me explain the main groups here. We have managers, professionals, the two top groups. They represent highly skilled occupations that usually require a superior diploma. We have next the light blue, the specialists like technicians, clericals, and customer service. Usually they perform repetitive tasks, but these machines cannot easily replace these tasks. Sales and laborers are occupations specialized in routine manual tasks. Okay, sales not too much, but Amazon is replacing sales. Okay, you can think like that. And machine can easily, you can easily replace these blue collars activities and sales by machines or by Amazon, or offshore these activities to China. Service occupations are specialized in non-routine manual tasks. Is the orange group here, taking care of others, food and services. So this is the polarization that we are having. The orange group is not reducing, is increasing in the United States. You have a lot of delivery guys there. Okay, you have a lot of waiters, but we are reducing this group here. Which is the middle class, the guys that are voting for Trump now because they are losing their jobs, the blue collars, and they are blaming the professionals who are Democrats here. Okay, I don't know exactly anything about that. Sakamoto can complement me. Finally, we have the farming that is only important for Brazil. We have 10% of our population in the farming occupation. The United States is less than 1%. It is really a small group in the United States. Now we have the trend here for Brazil on the left, United States on the right. We can see that in both countries, we are increasing the share of white collars, specialists and professionals. These are occupations that cannot be offshore and cannot be easily replaced by machines, the blue groups. The main problem is here, the yellow group. They can be more easily be replaced. United States, I think this trend is more relevant than in Brazil. We didn't reach the level of development of the United States yet. We hope that someday. And you can see also that the low service is not changing so much. The United States even increasing. So you are increasing the orange group, unskilled services activities, and also polarized economy. Here you are increasing also some specialized professionals, specialists in IT, for example. And you are reducing the blue collars, the yellow group. I think this is the main message, and this is one of the reasons why we saw in the previous slides that inequality increased in the United States, while inequality reduced in Brazil, especially because we have a minimum wage affecting the wages, and also because I will show in the next slides that this group was also benefited by the commodity boom, especially the rural works also, they increased a lot of the income and minimum wage. These groups here, the bottom classes in Brazil are really attached to minimum wage. So minimum wage almost doubled in this period in Brazil. So it has a really huge impact on the income of these bottom classes and on total inequality in Brazil. The problem is, how can we sustain this growth? This is a question that you can answer me in the final discussion. So how can employment shapes inequality? I think this is the title of my presentation. It's this graph you try to summarize everything. Inequality, occupations are more important for inequality in developing countries. What is I will not explain this tail index here, but it's a measure of how the difference between occupations explain the total inequality in the labor market. We have 20 groups of occupations, for example, how the average difference between these groups explain total inequality. So the dark blue is the share of inequality explained by occupations. The light blue are the share that is not explained by occupation, explained by other factors: education, age, gender, and racial discrimination. I don't know, some other factors here. We can see that in Brazil, between inequality that is explained by occupations represents nearly 1/3 of the total inequality. In the United States, this is less than 20% of total inequality. In the United States, inequality is more related to difference between some skills that some professionals need. For example, an economist without economist that does not know Python in the United States probably will not be so successful nowadays like before. So some special skills that are between these occupations are more important right now in the United States. In Brazil, occupations are still matters a lot. In Brazil, we are reducing the inequality also. This inequality is reducing both within and between occupations. We can make some hypotheses here. Probably, for example, inequality between occupations is probably declining because of institutional policies like the minimum wage. So we are boosting the earnings of the bottom groups. And minimum wage does not affect so much the top groups. We will not be affected. We professors will not be affected by the minimum wage. Okay, it's a reference, but not directly like the bottom class, that by law they receive a minimum wage. Inequality between occupations is probably declining in Brazil due to the increasing supply. It's a hypothesis that some studies had highlighted. Due to the increasing supply of workers with a superior diploma, declining marginal returns of education, which means that the difference between occupations, a professional, for example, a clerical worker with superior diploma or without superior diploma will not make a huge difference like 10 years, 20 years ago, because we have a lot of clerical workers with superior diploma. It's not a big deal anymore. In the United States and most developed countries, we had the opposite trend. Inequality between occupations increasing, especially between occupations increasing, probably as a result of the polarization, as I highlighted in the prior slides. Blue collars are becoming scarcer in the United States. Okay, now I will try to match occupations and economic sectors. I don't know how much time I still have here. How much, Carol?
I think around 15, 20 minutes. Gori, do you think so?
Okay.
Do you need more? It's
no,
fine.
I don't. But how many minutes? It's here 2 hours. And
it's 45. You talked for 45 minutes.
Okay, so I will advance here. Okay, I will talk briefly about this. Okay. We have a huge difference between the structure of activities, but I want to highlight that the structure is not the only problems that we have. We have also huge difference between each economic sector. It's not a matter that, okay, we are specialized in agriculture and mining, Vale do Rio Doce, and Cargill, who is acting here in the modern agriculture in Brazil. But when we compare labor productivity between each sector, differences are huge, the same way that in the United States are 4 times higher in the United States. This is one of the main results I think we had. Labor productivity is 4 times higher in the United States. Labor earnings are 4 times higher in the United States. Okay, it's easy. So let's increase labor productivity and our problems are over. One problem in Brazil is that we have huge regional inequalities. Hartman highlighted, this is one problem. Okay, when we compare the modern agriculture in the Midwest in Brazil and the United States, labor productivity is even higher in Brazil when you compare. We are more productive than we are the superstar firm of agriculture in the world nowadays. It's really hard to compete with the modern agriculture. But you know, we have huge levels of inequality. This is the same production of cotton in the Northeast. I visit these farmers. They are poor, they have no access to technology and really hard life conditions. So the difference between productivity is really hard to compete. A small family farm competing with the modern agriculture. No way, they are migrating to urban areas. So this is the trend for the next decades. It's really hard to change demographic trends. So we can expect that the share of people working in the agriculture will reduce in Brazil in the next decades. I think this is inevitable. We need to provide jobs for them in the service, in the industry. This is what we have to think. And we cannot stop with the modern agriculture in Brazil. We will not survive without the modern agriculture, I think. Okay, we must take care with the environment, but this is not the subject of this presentation. What else can I highlight here? Again, for agriculture, we have in Brazil, to express these high levels of inequality, we have 1% of the farms in Brazil are responsible for 50% of the total agricultural production in Brazil. Probably these are the same guys that export. So we have huge levels of inequality, and if you reduce this inequality, probably we will increase a lot our labor productivity. This is the first message, I think, to reduce inequality. You probably watch this American Factor. If the Americans cannot compete with a Chinese factor, can you imagine we from Brazil and the other Latin American countries competing with the factor in the United States? We have structural problems. It's not so easy. When you compare here by economic sector, the levels of labor productivity, we can see that labor productivity is lower in Brazil for all the economic sector. So if we only solve the problems, okay, let's increase the share of service workers in Brazil, that our problems are over. It's not over because our labor productivity is not good enough. Is it good enough to redistribute income? I don't know. I think we have room to increase a lot our labor productivity yet. We are still a poor country in terms of per capita income. Like Sakamoto said, I don't remember which country has $18,000 of per capita income. It's even higher than Botswana. Botswana has a higher per capita income than Brazil. And we used to say that we are a rich country, but we need to explore our wealth better. So let me conclude here with this final presentation. When we matched the occupations with the sectors, we created a ratio comparing it's basically a measure of the average earnings of each occupation and over the average productivity, the sector where the employed is working. For example, if you are a engineer, what is your income? You divide your income by the average productivity of the economic sector where you are working. So we have the average trend here. We can see the occupations. So if we have, this is the relative wages for each occupation. So again, a relative wage near to 1 means that in this occupation, people are benefiting in the same level that productivity, labor productivity. Productivity increases, earnings will also increase in this occupation. If the relative wage for one occupation is higher than 1, it means that the earnings are growing faster than labor productivity where they are working. For example, in Brazil, we can see that the bottom groups, the orange and the yellow, the low services and the blue colors in Brazil benefited benefit most of the growth in Brazil, because the increase of average earnings for these groups was higher than increase of the labor productivity for the sectors on average where they work. In the United States, I think the difference is lower in the United States because the variability is lower, as I showed in the previous slides. In the United States, market-oriented economy, earnings are more attached to labor productivity. In Brazil, we have policies affecting this distribution. The exception here in Brazil is the farming sector, because this is because of our levels of regional inequality. Productivity in the agricultural sector increased a lot in the last decades in Brazil. We were insufficient in food production 30 years ago, and now we are one of the main players of agriculture in the world. So productivity increased a lot, but not everybody benefits of this increase. So in this sense, the relative wage is much lower than one. Okay, we are not redistributing the growth of labor productivity for everyone. We have those family farmings in the Northeast, they are not benefiting from this growth in labor productivity in the agricultural sector. This explains why we have this relative wage much lower. In the United States, the same to some extent. Not everybody benefit. We have a lot of immigrants, I think, working in this sector. Sakamoto has a paper highlighting this, what are the groups that have the lower wage premium in relation to productivity. And he highlighted that the Mexicans are in the worst position, I think, in the United States. So maybe this can explain also why the Mexicans are not benefiting a lot of the productivity increase in the agriculture in the United States. So some messages here are, first, economic growth is needed. We need economic growth. It's much easier to redistribute with economic growth, but it's not enough. We need the economic growth, not only adding labor force in the economy. We need to increase the labor productivity, and you need to redistribute a lot of things, a lot of challenges. And occupations explain a lot inequality, especially in developing countries. We don't know if in the next stage of development we will face the same, or we have the same problems that are happening in the United States, but occupations are yet really important to explain inequality in Brazil. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm open here for comments and discussion.